How many times have you been on the internet and noticed creepy ads that are tailored to your internet search history? Or speaking of search history, how many times have you been on the internet and worried that somebody, perhaps even your government, are tracking the websites that you visit? Well, fortunately, today's video is sponsored by Nordvpn, which is helping to give internet users all the tricks and tools of a proper 21st century online experience. Now, you may have heard me talk about what Nordvpn could do for you previously: encrypt your internet data and move your online activity to another location with just one click, either for superior security or new streaming options. And all of that is still true. Nordvpn has more than 5,000 servers spread through 60 countries, but VPNs give you access to so many more options than just new TV shows. Having trouble connecting to social media where you live? NordVPN. Want to buy a movie that's cheaper somewhere else or maybe not available in your country at all? NordVPN. Want to route your connection through multiple servers just for double-layered protection? Yes, NordVPN. Look, with NordVPN you could do it all, and that includes utilizing their threat protection upgrade, which blocks ads, eradicates web trackers, checks for malware, and more. Right now, as part of a unique deal, you guys can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount plus an additional 4 months for free. And if you try NordVPN and change your mind, they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. All you got to do is go to nordvpn.com/TIFO. Again, nordvpn.com/TIFO for a 2-year deal at a huge discount plus 4 free months on top of that as a bonus, or just follow the link below. And now today's video. In one of the more memorable scenes of 2012's The Avengers, Nick Fury, director of the fictional spy agency S.H.I.E.L.D., reveals to our titular heroes the agency's fleet of helicarriers, gargantuan flying vehicles capable of deploying anywhere in the world, turning invisible, and launching a squadron of fighter jets at a moment's notice. They are the ultimate comic book vehicles, ridiculously awesome but hopelessly impractical and implausible. Or are they? Since the dawn of mad flight, the idea of airborne aircraft carriers has fascinated engineers and military planners, promising the means of rapidly projecting overwhelming air power to every corner of the globe. In the century or so since, engineers have made weird, wonderful, and often ingenious attempts to make this dream a reality with varying levels of success. A flying aircraft carrier is, at its heart, an attempt to solve a fundamental contradiction inherent in aircraft design. Long-range military aircraft bombers require large amounts of fuel in order to reach their targets. This in turn requires said aircraft to be large, making them slow and vulnerable to enemy air defenses. Fighter aircraft, by contrast, are faster, more maneuverable, and can more easily evade enemy aircraft and missiles, but their small size and fuel capacity severely limit their maximum range. One solution to this problem is the Parasite aircraft, a smaller, faster vehicle that is carried and launched by a larger, longer-range one, effectively combining the best of both worlds. The first Parasite aircraft were launched from lighter-than-air dirigibles, with the first experiments taking place during the First World War. In 1915, British naval officer Neville Osborne began experimenting with launching a BE-2C fighter aircraft from an SS-class naval blimp as a means of intercepting and shooting down German Zeppelin bombers. The airship, he reasoned, would allow the fighter to reach the Zeppelin's operating altitude faster and using less fuel than if the aircraft took off normally from the ground. Unfortunately, during the first experimental flight on the 21st of February 1916, the airship envelope lost pressure at 4,000 feet, causing the aircraft to plummet to the ground. Osborne and his co-pilot were killed on impact. In May of that year, a Felixstowe Port Baby flying boat took to the skies with a Bristol Scout fighter mounted to its upper wing. At the height of 300 meters, the Scout separated from its mothership, and both aircraft landed safely, the first mid-air launch of one aircraft from another. This system, too, was intended as an anti-Zeppelin defense, the flying boat greatly extending the patrol range of the smaller, faster fighter. Throughout the war, both British and Germans experimented with defending rigid airships using Parasite fighters, though none of these systems entered service before the war ended. The first nation to develop a practical flying aircraft carrier, however, was the United States. In 1929, the US Navy rigid airship USS Los Angeles was used to demonstrate the feasibility of an aerial launch and recovery system for Parasite fighters. Vought U-01 biplanes were fitted with a docking hook mounted above the wing, which hooked onto a specially designed trapeze, which could be raised and lowered from the hull of the airship. Once the aircraft was securely docked, the trapeze was retracted, lifting the aircraft into the airship's ship's internal hangar. To launch the craft, the process was reversed. These test flights were highly successful, and in 1931 the Los Angeles' temporary trapeze system was removed and fitted to the purpose-built U.S. Navy airship USS Akron, which could launch and recover up to 4 specially modified Curtiss F-9C Sparrowhawk fighters from its 23-meter-long hangar. The Akron was intended to serve as the eyes of the US Navy, using its greatest speed and complement of Parasite fighters to scout ahead of the surface fleet. But the airship would never get the chance to test its capabilities in combat, for on April 4, 1933, the Akron was caught in a thunderstorm off the coast of New Jersey and crashed into the sea, killing 73 of the 76 men on board. It was the largest loss of any airship accident in history, and for more on another major but relatively unknown airship disaster, please do check out our previous video, the largely forgotten airship disaster that helped kill the cruise ships of the sky, and that's on our sister channel, Highlight History. Now, following the disaster, Akron's remaining Sparrowhawk fighters were transferred to her sister ship, the USS Macon, but she, too, was lost in a storm off the coast of Big Sur, California, on February 12, 1935. Thankfully, due to warmer weather conditions and safety equipment installed in the wake of the Akron disaster, all but 2 of the Macon's 66 crew were rescued. However, her loss effectively put an end to the age of the dirigible aircraft carrier. Meanwhile, over in the Soviet Union, trials were underway of a more bizarre but ultimately more successful Parasite fighter scheme. Starting in June 1931, Vladimir Vakhmistrov of the Red Air Force's Scientific Test Institute began experimenting with mounting various combinations of small fighters and dive bombers to the wings of heavy bombers. The goal of these experiments, officially dubbed Zvenyo but nicknamed Vakhmistrov's Circus, was to create a flexible, long-range strike force. By launching in midair, the dive bombers could carry heavier bomb loads than they could normally take off with, whilst the fighters could provide the mothership bomber with its own long-range escort. Cleverer still, Vakhmistrov calculated that the extra thrust from the attached aircraft would more than compensate for the increase in weight, helping the heavily laden bomber to take off. No provision was made for the Parasite aircraft to redock with the mothership, meaning they had to fly back to base and land independently. However, as the greatest amount of fuel is consumed during takeoff and climb, the air-launched Parasites enjoyed a significant increase in range. Throughout the 1930s, the Zvenyo concept went through a number of iterations, culminating in the Zvenyo SPB, consisting of a Tupolev T-3 heavy bomber carrying 4 Polikarpov 116 SPB dive bombers, 2 mounted above the bomber's wing and 2 below. Amazingly, despite the complexity and inherent danger to performing mid-air launches and taking off and landing with up to 5 fighters attached to it, in its decade of development, the Zvenyo program suffered only one serious accident in which a Parasite fighter crashed into the mothership during docking, killing the pilot. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the ungainly Zvenyo-SPB combination was pressed into service and scored a number of surprising victories. The first came in August when the squadron attacked the King Carol Bridge in Nazi-occupied Romania, which carried a section of the Ploiesti Constanta oil pipeline over the Danube River. The attack succeeded in destroying an entire span of the bridge, and despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, all Zvenyo aircraft returned to the base safely. The unit would fly a further 30 missions, successfully bombing the Constanta docks and Ploiesti oil refineries and destroying a bridge across the Dnieper River. However, increasing enemy air superiority quickly rendered the Zvenyo aircraft vulnerable and obsolete, and in 1942, the unit was disbanded. To this day, the Zvenyo raids remain among the only successful military missions ever carried out by Parasite aircraft. The late 1930s also saw a unique application of the Parasite aircraft concept to the field of commercial aviation. While by this time many aircraft had flown across the Atlantic, none could make the crossing non-stop while carrying a commercially viable load of mail, making the establishment of a profitable transatlantic airmail service a challenging prospect. But in 1938, Belfast-based seaplane manufacturers Short Brothers came up with an ingenious, if radical, solution. At the time, it was well known that an aircraft could sustain flight carrying a heavier load than it could take off with, and that a large proportion of its fuel was consumed during takeoff and climb. It thus followed that if an aircraft could be carried aloft by another and launched at cruising speed and altitude, it would achieve the maximum possible fuel efficiency and thus range for a given payload. To exploit this loophole, Shaw created an aircraft combination that it called the Short-Meyer Composite, consisting of an S-20 seaplane dubbed Mercury mounted atop an S-21 flying boat dubbed Meyer. Mail was carried aboard Mercury, which in turn was carried into the air by Meyer and released. Meyer then returned to base while Mercury and its payload carried on to their destination. The short Meyer composite made its first coupled flight on January 20th, 1938, followed by the first in-flight separation on February 6th. Incredibly, the bizarre piggyback combination worked perfectly, and after only a handful of test flights, the aircraft were acquired and operated by Imperial Airways on an experimental basis. The short Meyer composite made its first commercial flight on July 21st, 1938, with Mercury being launched by Meyer near Foynes Island, carrying 454 kilograms of newspapers and photos. The aircraft then flew on to Montreal, Canada, covering the 4,720-kilometer journey in 20 hours and 21 minutes. This was the first non-stop commercial transatlantic flight by a heavier-than-air craft, and proved that a transatlantic airmail service could be commercially viable. The short Meyer composite would go on to make a number of pioneering flights, including a 9,561-kilometer journey from Scotland to South Africa in October 1938 that set a world non-stop distance record for seaplanes. The aircraft then flew a regular mail route between Southampton, England and Alexandria, Egypt until September 1939, when the outbreak of the Second World War led to the service being cancelled. The aircraft were later destroyed in a German bombing raid on May 11th, 1941, but by the time the war ended, Short's clever solution had become obsolete, for wartime advancements in aviation technology had resulted in aircraft capable of carrying a commercially useful load of mail and even passengers across the Atlantic non-stop. During the war, several nations experimented with combination and Parasite aircraft, though with the exception of the Soviet Zvenyo program, few of these concepts saw operational use. Late in the war, the Nazis came up with a wide variety of last-ditch interceptor aircraft to stem the tide of Allied bombers relentlessly pounding Germany's cities and industry to rubble. Among these was the Messerschmitt Me328, a tiny single-seat fighter built mainly of wood and powered by a pair of cheap Argus AS-014 pulse jet engines, the same engines used by the Fieseler Fi-103 flying bomb, better known as the V-1. As the Me-328 could not carry enough fuel to reach the altitude of Allied bombers on its own, it was to be carried aloft and released by a mothership aircraft. However, problems with the reliability of the pulse jet engines led to the project being cancelled in 1944, and none ever saw combat. Slightly more successful was the Yokosuka Mxy7 Oka, or Cherry Blossom, developed as part of Imperial Japan's kamikaze suicide aircraft program. Essentially a piloted missile, the 6-meter-long aircraft consisted of a 1,200-kilogram explosive warhead fitted with a wooden tail and wings, a cramped cockpit, and 3 solid fuel rocket motors. The Oka was carried to the target area by a Mitsubishi G4M Betty mothership and released, whereupon the pilot would glide the aircraft towards the enemy fleet. Once close enough, the pilot would light the rocket motors and accelerate to 650 kilometers per hour, making the Oka almost impossible to intercept or shoot down as it careened towards its target. However, the weapon had one glaring Achilles heel: its lumbering mothership, which was vulnerable to being shot down by patrolling Allied fighters before it got anywhere near its target. Nonetheless, the aircraft managed to score a few successes during the 1945 Battle of Okinawa, damaging 9 and sinking 1 US Navy ship. The end of the Second World War and the start of the Cold War brought renewed interest in the Parasite fighter concept. In 1949, the US Air Force took delivery of the largest aircraft in its arsenal, the gargantuan Convair B-36 Peacemaker. Designed to strike bases in Japan from Hawaii, the war ended before the B-36 could see service. However, the aircraft was perfect for the newly formed Strategic Air Command, or SAC's mission of nuclear deterrence. 50 meters long and with a 70-meter wingspan, the B-36 could carry 39,000 kilograms of bombs over a distance of over 6,000 kilometers, allowing it to strike targets deep in the Soviet Union from air bases in the continental United States. But there was a problem. Wartime experience had completely shattered the 1930s-era notion that the bomber will always get through, revealing even the most heavily armed bombers would be highly vulnerable to enemy interceptor aircraft. Bombers thus had to be escorted to their targets by long-range fighters like the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and North American P-51 Mustang. However, no contemporary fighter could come close to matching the intercontinental range of the B-36. Thankfully, the Air Force had a clever solution: have the bomber carry its own escorts. In early 1945, as the Second World War was coming to a close, the US Army Air Forces put out a requirement for a small Parasite jet fighter that could be carried in, launched, and recovered from the bomb bay of the B-36, the winning proposal being submitted by McDonnell Aircraft on March the 19th and designated the XF-85 Goblin. The Goblin was one of the smallest jet aircraft ever built, with an egg-shaped fuselage 5 meters long and a wingspan of 6.5 meters. Powered by a Westinghouse XJ-34 turbojet engine, it could reach a maximum speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour and was armed with 4 50 caliber machine guns. However, due to its small size, endurance was limited to only 30 minutes of flight time. Like the Sparrowhawk fighters on the USS Akron and Macon airships, the Goblin was launched and recovered using a retractable trapeze mounted in the mothership's bomb bay, the aircraft hooking onto the trapeze via a folding hook mounted just forward of the cockpit. The Air Force planned to deploy mixed fleets of both bomb and fighter-carrying aircraft so that the latter could protect the entire fleet against enemy interceptors. McDonnell built 2 prototype CF-85s fitted with steel skids on the lower fuselage and wingtips in case the pilot was forced to make an emergency landing. Testing began in mid-1948 at Muroc Field, today Edwards Air Force Base in California, with Edwin Skocker assigned as chief test pilot. As production B-36s were not yet available, launch and recovery tests were performed using a modified Boeing B-29 Superfortress dubbed Monstro. As the B-29 was considerably smaller than the B-36, the XF-85 could not fit entirely within its fuselage and had to be carried half exposed beneath the bomb bay. On July 23, 1948, Skocker and the XF-85 flew the first of 5 captive flights suspended beneath the B-29 in order to determine the aerodynamic effects of the Parasite aircraft on the mothership. This was followed by the first free flight on August 23, during which Skocker was launched from the trapeze at an altitude of 6,000 meters. After flying the XF-85 for 10 minutes to evaluate its maneuverability and handling, Skocker attempted the first in-flight trapeze hookup. The results were less than encouraging. The XF-85 proved highly sensitive to the turbulent air currents given off by the mothership, and Skocker struggled to line up his docking hook with the trapeze. On his third attempt, he misjudged the approach and collided with the trapeze, which ripped through the canopy and tore off Skocker's helmet and oxygen mask. Thinking quickly, he stuffed the severed oxygen hose in his mouth and piloted the damaged aircraft to a hair-raising emergency landing on a dry lake bed below. In the wake of this incident, McDonnell made numerous modifications to the XF-85, including adding small vertical fins to the wings and tail to increase the aircraft's stability. After 7 weeks, test flights resumed, with Skocker finally performing a successful trapeze hookup on October 22, 1948. Skocker, however, found this feat difficult to repeat, and on his 5th hookup attempt, he collided again with the trapeze, breaking off the XF-85's docking hook and forcing him to once again make an emergency landing. McDonnell engineers proposed all sorts of solutions to the docking problem, such as extending the trapeze below the turbulent air surrounding the mothership, but it was already too late. Unimpressed by the aircraft's performance, the Air Force cancelled the XF-85 program on the 24th of October 1949. In all, the 2 prototypes made 7 test flights for a total flight time of 2 hours and 19 minutes, only managing to successfully hook up to the trapeze on 3 occasions. Yet despite the failure of the XF-85, the US Air Force was far from finished with the Parasite fighter concept, and in 1950 it launched the even more outlandish MX-1019 program, better known as Project Tiptoe. This concept called for a pair of Republic F-84 Thunderjet fighters to be mated to the wingtips of a B-36 bomber via special docking clamps. The configuration would effectively increase the area of the bomber's wings, increasing its efficiency and range while allowing it to carry its own fighter escort. Testing began in late 1950 using 2 F-84s and a modified B-29 as a mothership. Due to the B-29's powerful wingtip vortices, mating the aircraft in flight was difficult, while the docking clamps proved temperamental and required constant modification. But the greatest headaches came from the flexibility of the B-29's wing, which required the F-84 pilots to continuously fly their aircraft even when docked to prevent them from being torn free. Nonetheless, the test pilots managed to perform a number of successful dockings and undockings and to fly docked with the mothership for a total of 2 hours and 40 minutes. Meanwhile, Republic engineers developed an automatic control system to save the F-84 pilots from the fatigue of having to continuously pilot their aircraft during a long strike mission. The system was first tested on April 24, 1953 over Peconic Bay, New York, with the left-hand F-84 performing an in-flight docking. As soon as the automatic control system activated, however, the F-84 immediately flipped over and collided with the B-29, causing both aircraft to crash with the loss of all 6 crew on board. Meanwhile, a similar program codenamed Project TomTom was being pursued by Convair, using semi-flexible wingtip couplings that alleviated some of the problems encountered by Tiptoe. However, turbulence still made dockings and undockings a fraught process, and on September 23, 1956, an F-84 flown by test pilot Beryl Erickson unexpectedly tore away from its wingtip coupling. While both the F-84 and mothership landed safely, the concept was finally declared infeasible and dangerous, and both Tiptoe and TomTom were cancelled. Undaunted, the Air Force returned to the bomb bay trapeze launch configuration employed by the XF-85 Goblin, only using the much more capable F-84. This time the goal was not to provide bombers with fighter escort, but to increase the range of nuclear-armed or reconnaissance fighter bombers. According to this scheme, the mothership would ferry its Parasite fighter to the vicinity of the target and release it, allowing the fighter to carry out a high-speed nuclear strike or reconnaissance mission while the mothership loitered safely out of range of the enemy air defenses. This object was dubbed FICON, short for Fighter Conveyor. The launch and recovery process for FICON was identical to the XF-85, using a retractable trapeze and a docking hook mounted to the top of the F-84's fuselage. However, as the F-84 was considerably larger than the XF-85, it could not fit fully inside the B-36 mothership's fuselage and protruded out into the airstream, producing a significant amount of drag and reducing the mothership's range by about 10%. On the plus side, the F-84 pilot was able to leave his aircraft and enter the mothership's crew cabin, greatly reducing fatigue on the long flight to and from the target. FICON test flights began in early 1952 over Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, with the first full launch, hookup, and retrieval taking place on May the 14th of that year. A total of 170 successful launches and recoveries would be performed over the following year, proving the FICON concept to be a viable one. In 1953, the Air Force ordered 10 production B-36s and 25 F-84s to be converted into FICON aircraft. These aircraft entered service in 1955, seeing limited use with the 91st and 99th Strategic Reconnaissance Wings. However, by this time, the Parasite fighter concept was already obsolete. The recently perfected technology of in-flight refueling proved a far more effective and safer means of extending the range of fighter and strike aircraft, while the high-flying Lockheed U-2 spy plane rendered the short-range F-84 redundant. After less than a year of service, the FICON system was cancelled on April 27, 1956. Yet the Parasite fighter concept simply refused to die and continued to fascinate engineers for decades to come. For example, in the 1970s, Boeing drafted a radical proposal to turn its iconic 747 jumbo jet into an airborne aircraft carrier, or AAC. The scheme called for the aircraft's massive cargo bay to be gutted and fitted with an elaborate conveyor belt system for storing, launching, and recovering up to 10 specially designed microfighters. As conceived, the system would be capable of launching 2 fighters every 80 seconds, allowing an entire air wing to be deployed in as little as 15 minutes. Boeing envisions the aircraft as an escort for squadrons of B-52 bombers, capable of rapidly deploying large numbers of fighters to protect the bombers from enemy interceptors. But while impressive on paper, the AAC suffered from a number of fundamental flaws, including the minor fact that the very concept was thoroughly obsolete. Combat experience in the Vietnam War had demonstrated that the primary threat to bombers was no longer interceptor aircraft, but rather surface-to-air missiles against which there was no defense aside from passive countermeasures like flares and radar chaff. Furthermore, in order to fit in a 747's cargo bay, Boeing's proposed microfighters would have had to have been extremely stripped-down vehicles without room for the powerful engines, radar, avionics, armor, and weapons found in most modern fighters. The microfighters would thus have been outclassed by any enemy interceptors they were likely to encounter, making them of dubious value on the modern battlefield. Unsurprisingly, the AAC never left the drawing board, and the tantalizing but elusive dream of the flying aircraft carrier was finally put to rest. Or was it? Intriguingly, in this age of unmanned aerial vehicles, aka drones, the Parasite aircraft concept may be poised to make a comeback. In 2014, the Pentagon and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, unveiled the Gremlins project, an initiative to launch and recover small X-61A reconnaissance drones in midair from a Lockheed C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. Adaptable to a wide variety of launching aircraft, the Gremlins system would allow air power to be projected more rapidly enter more regions of the globe than with a conventional seagoing aircraft carrier. While not as impressive as Marvel's massive helicarriers, I think we can all agree they're still pretty cool. We just have one burning question. Can you feed the drones after midnight?